right, good morning. We are in Genesis part 4, lesson 1. So we're beginning a new segment. We've moved from Abraham into the next relationship in this journey that God has with his people. We're actually moving quite quickly. Were you guys surprised at how quickly it seemed like we hit Isaac and Rachel, but then boom, we're already into Esau and Jacob? It was like, whoa, that was quick. Did you ever really notice that before when you had read? Didn't either. I always kind of thought all of them had long amounts of history, but it almost seems like Isaac and Rachel are just Rebecca. I'm going to call her Rachel all day. Just ignore me. It's Rebecca. I had to look even because I knew as soon as it came out of my mouth, it's not Rebecca. It's not Rachel. It is Rebecca. Isaac's wife. That'll give me covered, right? All right, so, but this couple, they're almost like just this little bleep on the horizon here of this big story. However, did you also notice how that chapter 25 was like enormous? It was extremely lengthy, 24. Oh, sorry, you're right, 24. 67 verses. Yeah, 67 verses. This is insane. Did you think you were never going to get to the end of your observation worksheets? I just kept thinking, when will it end? But when I finished looking at this and I began to really kind of, it's kind of like you have to do all the work first. Try to begin to kind of title things in a tentative way, because you kind of start with a pencil, something you can erase, right? And then once you kind of get those first thoughts down on paper, then what you're going to do is you're going to pull back and look at it from the bigger picture and say, what is God showing us here, right? The question in this is, why this account? What is God showing us in this account that teaches us something about who is God and who is man? And if you don't stop and do it from that perspective in your homework time, boy, can you ever get lost in something that's as lengthy and detailed as this chapter 24 is. Also, to add a little more complication to things, that is with 25, we did half of it already last week, and now we're jumping back into it. But we're inserting this 24 before it and then picking up at the last half of 25. I felt like that was a little... I understand why they did it. They wanted to keep the characters together. They wanted to fulfill the storyline of Abraham as best they could, and then add in the follow-on with Isaac. But to me, it was a little hard to keep my brain straight. So what we're going to do when we do this today is we are going to do a full outline on 24 and 25 and try to parse through each of them, but in order to keep it sequential from the way that it's written in the account scripturally. Otherwise, we're going to never keep it straight in our heads later. When you and I come back to the Word of God after we're done with this study and a year or two passes, we're going to be so confused if we don't make sure we get it in the order that it's actually in the record. So we're going to try to do it that way together. I hope that makes sense to you. But we are going to spend quite a lot of time in 24. Now, on the whole, tell me, let's just talk about the major things that you're looking for, right? We start out by looking for our key words. I'm not going to write them on the board. They're on my chart for you later. But tell me, what is it that we're looking for in a historical record when you look for these key words? What are you looking for? People, places, events. Thank you. Okay, good. All right, and so keeping that in mind, people, places, and events. And you did notice that Kay kept reiterating about the geographical locations. She wanted to make sure that you were marking those. Before I go back to asking you who are those people, places, and events, why do you think that Kay wanted you to pay special attention to those geographical locations and mark them? What do those geographical places reveal to us in this storyline? Have you considered that thought? I mean, that is key on this. This is actually really key. It's like this key that opens the door. Otherwise, you're not going to understand kind of what's going on here.
You have to know that, especially the servant, hey,
Right.
You have to know that he actually went somewhere away, not just like, oh, he walked across the street and he counted that as out of Canaan.
Okay. Now, why? Okay, so knowing that, then we've looked at Ishmael, and last week in our homework we talked about how Ishmael, it says, and Ishmael settled east of, where? East of his brother, east of Egypt, right? So, right, okay, so east of Egypt. And then we see now the servant is sent back to Mesopotamia, where Abraham was from, in order to assess or to appropriate a wife for his son. And then we see the story in the next chapter 25 with Rebecca, who has twins. And what was the thing that God told her about the twins in her womb? They would be two nations in her that were warring within her womb. Therefore, what we're seeing then is God is kind of, it's like cream. He's raising to the surface of your attention that these are geographical nations, right? And he's showing you relationships to one another, how they're going to relate to one another, how they're going to affect one another, and specifically, which of these nations is the apple of God's eye? Israel, the nation that Jacob eventually who is going to become Israel. And Israel is God's people, and and why are they special? Are they special because they're such great people and they walk so stellarly with God? No, absolutely not. As later in Scripture, there's verses that talks about these stiff-necked people, right? Their hearts are so stubborn towards God. And we've already seen demonstrated, even from Genesis 1 to this point, how often these men who are walking with God, men who do love God, but yet they fail and they fail and they fail. So it's not about the perfection of their walk or that they're such great people. Why is God so interested in this nation that will be called Israel?
Because he made a covenant because this is where Jesus is coming from.
Very good. Everybody's saying the same thing. It's because of the covenant that God made. Now, why did God make that covenant? Okay, so he selected a person who had a heart toward God, who was willing to submit to God's authority in his life, to bow his knee to him, to worship, to follow, right? All right, that's one reason, yes. Is that the most important reason that God is doing this thing called Israel? Bloodline to who? To Christ. Okay, so what we're looking at here then in Genesis on the whole is this journey that God is revealing to us about the redemption of man. We started back in Genesis chapter 3 with the fall, how man disobeyed God, and therefore God no longer walked among them, walked with them. Now he is at a distance. There's somewhat of a barrier between, and now he needs to repair this, or he wants to repair this, right? And so what he has now is a plan, and the plan was what? What did he promise Eve right there in the garden? A seed. So the seed is going to come. Now, in order for humanity to be, to be convinced that the seed is the seed when he does show up, what is God therefore doing right now that's going to make sure you and I would recognize this seed when he appears?
Creating a genealogy.
Okay, the genealogy has been given to us and it's being tracked. Okay. What else? Anything else? Okay, for instance, Abraham and Sarah, how did they get their genealogy? How did they get a son that would pass this seed line? Through miraculous miracles, through supernatural signs and wonders, so to speak. As a matter of fact, he actually says to Sarah very directly, is anything too difficult for God? Right? There's nothing too difficult for the Lord, because on a human level, on a human understanding, it's an impossibility for a woman of her age and a man of his age to have conceived a child. She had already been barren all her life. So for her to be given this child after a lifelong journey of barrenness, and now for her womb to be opened at the age of 90, and at the age of 100 for him, right? He is now allowed to have this child through this wife. This is a supernatural thing. And what God is doing for us is showing us something specific about this redemptive plan. And that is that it is a supernatural, divine work of God. It is not something that man could have planned out, plotted out, and executed. He takes the impossible and does things that are miraculous in order to reveal himself to us. In the doing of that, what does he show us about himself? What does God show us?
He's the end all and be all.
Yeah, okay. He's the end all, the be all. Okay, he's omnipotent. This is the all-powerful, almighty God. As a matter of fact, that's one of the titles we've already come across in our record. Have you been keeping your record on the names of God in each of these chapters so far? One of them is the Almighty, right? What else? He's relational. And so this broken relationship's a sadness to him. And it's a sadness to the degree that what is he willing to do? Yeah, eventually he's going to sacrifice his son. Now, what storyline have we covered that gave a demonstration of what that was all about? Yeah, Abraham going to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Moriah. And it was a foreshadow. And as a matter of fact, so specific is the foreshadowing, he literally says of that mountain at Moriah, in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And it was a direct reference to the fact that Jesus himself would come to that very mountain and be sacrificed. He would be crucified at Mount Moriah. And here we are all the way back in history with Abraham, and God says, you go to a mountain that I will show you. And he does. And he says, in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. So I gave you several verses so that you could go and kind of trace this story of how it is that the temple actually ends up at Mount Moriah. And I hope that you will follow and check that out for yourself, because that's just an amazing story. And when you connect all those pieces, again, it's a supernatural wonder that it even happened that way and that God did it in that way. So Israel later is going to go into the wilderness. When they leave Egypt, they're going to be wandering. And God is going to continually say to them over and over in the book of Deuteronomy, you shall worship me in the place that I shall show you. He had a specific place in mind. Where was it? In the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. He was going to direct them right to Jerusalem. They were going to be right there on that very mountain and in that exact place where God would make the sacrifice of his son. That's a supernatural wonder. Okay, so when you are marking geographical locations, what God is trying to show you is how he is the sovereign, almighty. He is the one who orchestrates. He is the one who manages, so to speak, the events of human affairs. As a matter of fact, remember in Daniel, it says he raises kings up and he puts kings down. And it's not that God is controlling the minds of men. It's not a manipulative move on God's part. But it is a unfolding plan that he's in control of. And he will use those who will be used, and he will literally judge those who will not bow their knee. So you can be either be for God or against God, but if you're against God, you will pay the price. And those who are with God, they will be the blessed of God. Is that not what we've been seeing so far? Okay, so as you're marking those geographical locations, I want you to keep in mind what God is showing you is where are they? Which people group are actually landing in specific places, and what does that mean to the bigger picture? Keeping in mind that Mount Moriah is the place in which God eventually wants his people to be, to live, and to land, that he will fulfill exactly what he just said back in 17 to Abraham, and he said, in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. So interesting was that this week Isaac was told or it's told to us about Isaac that he was dwelling where? At the Negev. And he actually names that little funny word, right? The Beer Lahai Roy. Remember that? And who named that place? That tongue twister. It was Hagar, right? Hagar. And what did it, do you remember what that meant? The God who sees and the God who hears, right? So it's the God who sees and the God who hears. And so that is the place where he is living at that time. But all the other places that are mentioned are outside of the land of Canaan. And we know it's the land of Canaan that one day will become the land of Israel. And that God has promised that land. And back in Genesis 15, when God cut covenant with Abraham, he said, from this point to this point, all this will be yours. And that's what the plan is, and that's the goal, and that's where we're headed. So that's why you have to keep track of the geographical locations of things. And you might even find that there'll be little insights if you pay attention to that. Once you double underline those locations, and you go look on a map, and you're going, aha, look at there. This person is right there in the heart of Israel. He's right in the land that God has promised to them. Or you might say, why is he outside of the land of Israel? What's going on here? Do you see what I'm saying? It can be clues for you as to, is this person in the will of God? Is he outside of the will of God? Or what is God doing in the moment? It'll help you to pose or to form questions for yourself about what's going on if you pay attention to the geography. Okay, that was my 101 teaching lesson this morning. Okay, now on to our lesson plan. I love to do that because I do think it's really important. I think sometimes we lose track of why, the why behind what we're doing. And sometimes Kay just throws it out there and says, mark the geographical location, but she doesn't really tell you why you're marking it. It's kind of more like, in our head, it's an exercise. Oh, just underlining it by rote. But I want you to understand the why behind it. Okay. All right, so now we're going to cover Genesis 24. We're going to look at Isaac and Rachel. So we spoke a moment ago that what we are looking for when we go to Mark and pay attention to certain things in a chapter, when you're in history, you're looking for people, places, and events. We've talked about the places, so now tell me the rest of it. Tell me the people and the events of this chapter. Who all is involved? Mm-hmm. Abraham, and I keep saying Abram too, and it's short, and you can get it written down easier on your paper. Okay.
And his servant.
Mm-hmm. And Rebecca. Okay. Right. All right. And what are some of the key words that are, I think, important in this narrative? What is the servant sent to look for? A wife. So the word wife would be an important one. Now, we've done a really thorough study on the subject of wife way back in Genesis part 1, remember? And we looked at the idea of the Isha, who came out of Isha to Isha, and what the purpose of the wife was, the designed roles of men and women. I mean, that's a touchy subject for some people, but it was an excellent study and a good thing for us to be aware of, that God has designed roles for us as wives. Any other keywords in this? Things that we might need to expound on and discuss in order to really get an idea of what's going on in the story. Prayer comes up, very good. Okay, master. Actually, yeah. Especially if you make it as a contrast to servant and master, right? Absolutely. What does Abraham make his servant do? Swear an oath. So I think that would be a key word in here. Why do you think I think that's a key word? How often does the subject of the fact that he swore an oath come up in this? Does it only come up once? No, it comes up over and over, right? It seems like it is the motivation behind how he's executing this mission that he's been sent on, and the seriousness of it, right? So that's all important for us to really draw our attention to so that we understand what it is that God is doing in this particular narrative. Go ahead.
Custom of putting your hand over someone's thigh.
Oh, yeah. See, because if we don't talk about swearing the oath, we're not going to get to talk about that. So you got to mark oath and swear, because then we're going to talk about the particular procedure of this very unusual oath that was made, okay? Now, I'm curious to hear what you all dug up on this. Yeah. Okay, and then that word loving kindness again shows up again, right? The idea of loving kindness. Don't forget to mark that. It is basically a synonymous word to covenant. So I always mark loving kindness in the same way I mark covenant. I do understand there's a distinction between them. One is to make a covenant, the other one is as a result of covenant. But anytime you see the word loving kindness, it's indicating to the reader that a covenant has preceded whatever's going on in the narrative. And God is acting as a response to that covenant in loving kindness. Okay, so loving kindness should definitely have been marked on your observation worksheet. Yeah. Okay, good. So there's the family. It's almost like the bloodline that's going on here. And what is it in contrast to? He says, "I want you to go to my kinsmen, but not to who? The Canaanites." So it's a contrast to the Canaanite women. He says, "I want you to look among the Canaanites, but not look among the Canaanites, but to go to my own family." And we need to discuss why that might be, right? And does that tie back to anything that we've already studied in Genesis, right? And the answer is yes, it does. There's another word you haven't brought up yet. I'm waiting, and it's associated with God himself. Did you make a list on God, the things that you learned about God? And if you did, look on that list, and are there any words, key words in there that you think are significant to this storyline? Especially concerning how he goes about to find this wife and who's in control of that.
Blessed.
Okay, blessed. That's a good one. Again, the idea of being blessed takes you back to the subject of covenant, doesn't it? Yeah.
He's referred to as the God of heaven.
I love that. That was something I hadn't even thought of to bring up yet. It's on my list, but yes, the Lord, the God of heaven, is whom God is called in this account. Now, why might that be? What is the emphasis in that title? Well, we know the Lord is relational. We know God is creator. And when he adds on there the part that says he's the God of heaven.
Well, that's where Christ dwells.
Okay, yeah.
Well, it says the God of heaven
And the God of earth, okay. And so what does that make you think of? When I say to you, he is the God of heaven and the God of earth. Creation, everything. So what subject comes up? What is God if he's the God, the ruler, the supreme, the master? Thank you, sovereignty. And if he's the sovereign, in regards to this storyline, what did we learn about him? What is his input on that subject of sovereignty in the choosing of this wife?
He'd already picked her. He'd
Yes.
already planned this out, and
So
this is-
what is the key word in the text? Did you see the word appointed? In verse 44. And it comes up again. Hold on, it's in one more place. 44. Because I think it's really cool here. It says, I will draw for your camels also. Let her be the woman whom the Lord has appointed. So what does that tell you about this storyline, about him going to find this wife for Isaac?
It's the design of God.
Picked her up.
It's not his. Yes, he's literally saying, Lord, I am your vessel. I am about your work. I'm not picking her. I'm waiting for you to show me the one you have picked for Isaac. So that word appointed becomes, there it is, it's in verse 14 again. So mark those two references. You have appointed for your servant Isaac. So this is the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. Do you see it? If you didn't pick up on that, that one's super, super important, even though it's only mentioned twice, because it ties into, again, God of heaven and earth, the sovereign God over all things. He is the one who is controlling this. Now, there's so much to talk on this. Okay, let's get started, because there's tons in this. Let's start with the first few verses. We're going to look at verses 1 to 9. And in that segment, the opening of this chapter, what do we see going on? We're just going to have to go little by little through each of those. We will have quite a bit of discussion, I think, on this.
Abraham instructs his servant to get a wife for Isaac.
Yeah, there you go. So Abraham. Abraham's servant sent to get a wife. Something along those lines, right, for Isaac. Whoop. All right. So now let's back up. Cynthia brought up the idea of this oath thing. Let's talk about the word oath and the word swearing. So he asked him to swear an oath, right? And did y'all do word study on that? I'm not hearing any yeses. Am I the only one that did it? Okay, it's number 7650, 𝐓𝐨𝐩𝐢𝐬. I can almost pronounce that. Did somebody say yes? I didn't see, because my back was turned. Yes, good job. Give us your answer there, Donna.
The thing that I found is to take an oath.
Mm-hmm.
To adjure.
I love that word, adjure. It sounds like a perfume. 𝐴𝐷𝐽𝑢𝑟𝑒, to adjure, to take an oath. Or simply the word promise, to promise something. Now, let's talk about how this actually is executed, because this is really an odd one. So let's look at the oath that he took with Abraham. He said the first thing he told him to do was what? Yeah, place your hand under my thigh. Okay, and then number 2, do what? Swear by the Lord. My pen is not good. By the Lord, the God of heaven and earth. In other words, the sovereign God, right? So now let's just discuss this. So that's what he was told to do, and that's what he did. But this, I mean, I don't know about you, but right away I spent hours in these first couple of verses, because I got stuck there, and I'm like, what in the world does this mean? What did you all find out about this I guess you would call it a practice, right, of how they made this particular oath? Apparently, this is going to come up again, by the way. It's going to come up in Genesis 47, 29 to 31. If you don't have that written down, write it down. So it's not isolated to only one place. We're going to see it twice. Therefore, it seems like that, to me, that says that it may be something that's fairly common, right? It's unusual to us. We've never heard of this, right? If you told me to put my hand under your thigh, I'd be going, right? Why do you think that is, and what did you learn about it when you did your work?
I found that the thigh was considered a source of posterity in the ancient world,
Yes,
or more properly, the loins or the testicles.
right.
The phrase under the thigh could be an euphemism for on the loins. There are 2 reasons why someone would take an oath in this manner. Abraham had been promised a seed by God, and this covenantal blessing was passed to his son and grandson. Abraham made his trusted servant swear on the seed of Abraham that he would find a wife for Isaac.
Okay.
The second one was Abraham had received
Oh, good. Okay, and you know what? That really fits perfectly in this one, but not as well when you move into 47. When you move into the next one, it's about Joseph he has them do the same thing, place the hand under the thigh, promise that you will take my bones back to Israel and bury me. Okay, so now you're going, okay, so I can't exclusively say it's about the Abrahamic covenant, right? It seems like, but maybe it's loosely connected in what way? Well, I think the first clue is the fact that when you do a word study on that word thigh, let's see if I've got that one.
Jacob got his thigh displaced when he read
His hip.
on his hip.
Yeah, but yes.
Like when you put your hand under the thigh, it's a sign of submission.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't hear that one. Did y'all hear that one? It's a sign of submission. Oh, cool.
And because they actually added, that's what Joseph was doing.
He absolutely was doing that with his servant. His servant was already under his authority, and now he's saying, I'm giving you a command on what I want done concerning my son's wife, and you're not to deviate from that, right? And then also, with that in mind, the fact that he then calls on the God, not just the Lord, but the God of heaven and earth, again, an authority reference, then that would be a double authority thing, that you're under his authority, you're under my authority, and don't deviate from it. That makes great sense to me. Okay? Any other thoughts on that? Okay. Well, first of all, what I do want to make sure that you all understand is every commentary that comments on this is guessing, because we don't have a firm record on exactly what does it mean to put under the thigh. But I do think we can make fairly well-educated guesses in the idea that context will rule for our understanding. So we are looking at this particular record and we're saying, well, so what do we think is going on here? Well, in the conversation back and forth between Abraham and the servant about what he's to go and do, and even the things that later the servant says to the family of Rebecca when he sees her, right? The emphasis is on the idea that God is the sovereign over it, and that he has been given specific instruction from his master, and he can't deviate from that. So it does seem like it has a lot to do with the submission to authority.
It's a very personal thing to put your hand under someone's thigh. I mean,
It is.
I mean, it's different from a handshake.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah, yeah. Well, possibly, now, what Donna mentioned in her reading of her article was possibly near the place of procreation, because it is a vow that will affect the generations who follow. That is true in this context. You know, the next one, not quite as much. However, you could sort of, when you see it with Joseph later, it could be, though, still that he is alluding to the fact that there is a covenant promise that is generational, that he associates with and he aligns himself with and that he has faith in, right? And therefore, because of that covenant, he wants to go back and be a part of that land that God promised. So you could, in a little twisted way, you could bring it back to the idea of that place of procreation and the bloodline.
Well, and also, I mean, it was Jacob's bones that were going to be Israel's
Right.
bones that were going to be taken back to Israel.
Was it Jacob or Joseph? I think it was Joseph.
Joseph was the son who was going to take Jacob's bones back, right?
Taking Joseph. Joseph is the one who was taken captive and ended up down there.
And then everybody else came, and then
And they were going to take Joseph's bones back because Joseph wanted to be a part of it. We'll get there, though. Don't worry about it. I understand you. See, this is the great thing about, doing this study is we're going to get these things back in our head again. And, we kind of lose all the details of these people because it's not something we read every day. But in 47:29 to 31, we'll get there when we approach that, and we'll parse it out. But the good thing is we'll have already encountered this idea of placing the hand beneath the thigh and the swearing of a vow, and understanding that it seems like the emphasis in this particular context has to do with authority and being completely obedient to that authority, not deviating from what is being requested of him. and recognizing also in it that it is God that is the one who is sovereign.
I beg to differ with 47:29.
Uh-huh.
It says, when the time for Israel to die drew near, he called his son Joseph and said to him, please, if I have found favor in your sight, place now your hand on my
Good job, Cynthia. Woo-hoo.
But Moses, I just looked at Moses carries out Joseph's bones.
Yes.
Okay.
That's why there's confusion.
Well, listen,
Promise is made
there's,
and he dies.
it doesn't really matter. All I know is it had to do with bones being carried back to the land. And that didn't really have anything to do with a marriage or procreation or the covenant promises through the bloodline necessarily. It was more of, I want my bones back on that land because I feel a connection to and I have faith in that covenant. So there still could be a connection with that. But I do think this is a really good exercise inductively as students for us to kind of parse through this a little bit, because sometimes there just isn't clear answers, in hard and fast answers. Just like every culture, we tend to lose sometimes our understandings of certain things because they're not continued on. They're not, something that we follow through on in generations that follow. We lose it, right? Did you ever hear the story of the woman who was teaching her granddaughter how to make a ham for her Easter dinner? And she cuts the end off. She says, first you cut the ends off. This is what Grandma did. Cut the ends off. You put it in this thing. And at some point, the daughter says, why am I cutting the ends off of this ham? And no, it was a ham, cutting the ends off the ham. And she said, I don't know. And so they went to ask Grandma. She says, oh, because my pan wouldn't fit that big ham. So that was her recipe. Cut the ends off and then put it in the pan. They were following it precisely because of tradition, but they didn't know why they were doing it. And then once they found out, they're like, oh, so you don't have to cut the ends off, right? Okay, so that's kind of my point. We don't always have the full understanding of these kinds of traditions. We lose why we're doing it. They just do it. So the commentaries that you're going to read, when you read on them, just take them all with a grain of salt. But I think the most important thing to do is to look at the context of what's being said here and try to draw out of the bigger picture of the storyline, this narrative that's presented, what might be the reason for him to put under the thigh. And I do think that what you said, Kristen, about that it being the place of strength, the thigh is the place of strength, and by placing your hand under that thigh, if they understand that to be submission, right, to that authority, then that makes perfect sense in this narrative, right? Okay, so, all right, so that was good discussion on that little tiny piece, and I spent a lot of time. Now, it said he made him swear an oath, and what was the oath about? He had to swear an oath, and what was the oath? Where was the wife to come from, or not to come from? Not a Canaanite. Right? There's your Canaanite. But from his relatives. Now, we probably need to discuss what that's about, right? What would that be about? Why not a wife from the Canaanites? There you go. Because what Abraham is doing is first of all, one of the things that we're catching on here is there is a little clue in here then that what Abraham is actually saying to us or alluding to us about is what God his relatives worship. Did you pick up on that? And later in the storyline, did you notice how when he makes mention of God of heaven and earth, and he speaks of the Lord, that this family responds in kind and with positive responses to him concerning that. Oh, well, if it's the Lord's matter, if this is God's doing, then we're not going to say something either way. We're going to just let God be the one that's in control of this. So what we see then is in this that what Abraham is seeking for his son Isaac then is what? A wife that has what? Similar faith systems, faith in God, right? That she will have been taught of the ways of Yahweh. And I think that's really awesome that this tells us where Abraham, it tells us a little more of a backdrop story to Abraham, doesn't it? Something that maybe we didn't fully have developed when we started in Genesis 11, where God calls him out of the land of the Chaldeans. How did he get called out of the land of Chaldeans? Well, how did he come to know Yahweh? Well, apparently some in his family were worshiping Yahweh. And he was one that God sought then and brought out to use for the mission that he had in mind, which is to bring about the seed through this specific nation.
First reference to Hebrew was made.
Right, yes.
Came from beyond.
Right, from another land or from far away or something. Yeah, yes. All right. So what we're seeing then is our picture here is beginning to develop that this is now tell me, how does this reinforce, or does it reinforce anything that we have looked at prior to this in Genesis so far? What happened in Genesis 6 when the sons of God married the daughters of men? Yeah. And who did we determine we feel like the sons of God are? The line of Seth, or believers just in general, right? I mean, I always say the line of Seth because that's the lineage that gets tracked from Seth then to Noah. And therefore, what we're seeing here is, again, a reinforcement of a principle of the two being equally yoked. And so when we did our study back when we looked at Ish and Isha, and we looked at the first marriage that God commenced, which was Adam and Eve, that we looked at the fact that what God wants from man is them to be equally yoked, that they would both worship God. And when you don't do that, we went into all kinds of cross-references, and I'm not going to take you there, but I wrote a ton down, and I'm just going to blurt them out for you to write down on your, I put them at the top of page 40, above where that verse 37, it says, "My master made me swear, saying, you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, in whose land I live." Do you see that verse? Okay, just above that, I just wrote a litany of verses. 2 Corinthians 6, 14 to 17. 1 Corinthians 15, 33. Here's my favorite one, Deuteronomy 7, 1 to 4. I love that one because that one it directly says, do not let your sons marry their daughters or your daughters to marry their sons, because if you do, what are they going to do?
Worship other gods.
Yeah, draw your hearts away to worship other gods, and you shall fall away from following me, and I will have to evacuate you off the lands, right? Okay, then 2 Timothy 3:5, Amos 3:3.
What was that again?
2 Timothy 3:5, and then Amos 3:3. I'm giving you a whole bunch of old and new, and I'm bouncing around because I want you to see. This is everywhere in Scripture, guys. This idea of do not be unequally yoked is so important to God. This is why, do you not think, this is why this whole chapter was actually written to us, and that we get 67 verses of it? That God goes in great depth and detail about the principles and really what the process of, at least of your thinking. Maybe we don't select mates for our children anymore, but there should be this same concept of what do you look for in a mate for your spouse, for your children, for your sons or your daughters, and what is it that you are to approve or not approve of concerning that, and what should the child submit to the authority of the parents in concerning that? Should they listen to their parents when their parents says, no, do not marry that person, or yes, I love them, marry them? I mean, that's what everybody wants to hear. But what if the mom or the dad says, no, I don't think this is a good choice for you? I know we've all been there. Look, talking to the choir here because I've been there, and it was sad, and it was brokenness, and it was divorce, and it was not for me, but for someone in my family, and it was a heartache. And all you have to do is go through it to understand this is the principle that God has in mind for us. Okay, go on. James 4:4, Ezra 10:11, 1 Kings 11:4, Deuteronomy 22:10, and now two more in 1 Corinthians. One's 5:11. The other is 7:39 and 40. And that gives you a nice litany of, now they're not on my chart, so if you can go back and catch the video if you need to. Huh?
You were busy.
I was busy. I went through and found as many. In other words, the bottom line to this is do not be unequally yoked, right? That is what God is saying. This is what Abraham is saying. This is what Abraham is projecting to us through this storyline. When you select a wife for my son, do not take her from the Canaanites because they do not worship Yahweh. And I want my son to have a wife who will be in oneness with him, one mind, one heart, one mission, the same qualities and characteristics of loving God and exemplifying what godliness should be like. And he wanted that oneness because I can tell you this, you might start out with a lot of passion and great feelings for one another, but if you don't have a oneness of mind concerning things that are the most important, which is relationship with God, your marriage is going to be in trouble at some point, unless God does a miracle and saves your spouse, whoever he or she is. That can happen. I'm not saying it can't, but it's a much harder road to go down. So why go down that road if you get a choice? Right? Start on the right track. Okay. All right. So now let's go to the next part of this. We're going to look at 10. Okay, this is verses 10 through 14. Okay. And it says he went, and how did he go? When he went, what did he do in those verses? Yeah, so he went prepared.
And then he prayed.
And pray, and by prayer cover, right? And I think those are two real important things. He took camels, he took gifts, and it says he went to where? Mesopotamia, right there, the very last verse in verse 10. And it says to the city of Nahor. Now, who was Nahor? Abraham's brother. And where did Nahor end up staying when Abraham left? Haran. Yeah, Haran. Yes, that's right, Haran. So the fact that he goes back up into that area, he basically went back to where he left some of his relatives, probably the closest location where relatives could be found. And apparently that was about a 500-mile trek. So it probably took him about 17 days to make that travel up there. Because Abraham, interestingly, when Abraham came into the land and God said, go from one end to the other and look at the land I'm going to give to you, right? When he stopped the looking, he stopped all the way at the bottom so that when it came time for the servant to go look for a wife for his son, he had to go all the way back up. So that was why it took so long. Okay. It says, now this is really interesting. He says now, he prays. What is it that he prays? What is he asking from God?
Success and loving kindness to his master.
Isn't that awesome? He wants loving kindness towards his master. So this is a man who, if he doesn't know the Lord himself, he at least respects his master so much that he really desires loving kindness towards him. Why do you think that also might be, besides just respecting his master? What flows downhill? Blessing. Yes. Well, I'm sorry, say that again? I'm saying, why would the servant want Abraham's prayers Why would he want Abraham to have this loving kindness from God that he would answer in the way that would be positive? Huh? Yeah, it's going to affect him in the long run, right? I'm not saying that all his prayer was selfish. I'm saying he probably really had love and respect for Abraham. It shows in everything that he's doing. He's got stellar character in this whole storyline.
And the loving kindness shown to Abram would be.
It will affect him, and it will also affect him. So he's praying for this loving kindness, and he says, "Behold, I am standing by the spring, and the daughters of men of the city are coming out to draw water. Now, may it be," and then he lays out a scenario, almost like throwing out a fleece before the Lord, right? He's saying, "God, will you do this for me so that I know it's you that's directing me to a specific girl?" Because otherwise, how is he going to know, right? So he gives God this request, and if it's her, will you please have her do some specific things? And what does she do? Those very things that he asked of. Isn't that amazing? It is a fleece. That's what I said. It's like he throws out a fleece before the Lord and says, "Lord, I don't know who it is that you have appointed for my master." And he says, "But if she be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac, and by this I will know that you have shown loving kindness to my master, if you do these specific things." And then, what does it say in 15 about how God answered that? Isn't that before he even finished? So what does that tell us about God? And he's listening, and he's all-knowing. He knew before it even was off his lips. He knew before, because think of it. The girl was already there. In other words, God had already brought her there as well, we think it's Eliezer, right? And as he is praying, the girl shows up. One of the first things, though, that catches his eye is what about her? She's beautiful and a virgin. So in other words, he probably assessed because of her age, and the modesty of her dress, and probably I think there were some characteristic clothing items that virgins wore versus married women. So I think he looked upon her, he saw the markings or something that was notable that he could understand. Obviously, he doesn't know if she's a virgin in our culture, but in their culture, he looked at her and said, "She's beautiful, and she is a virgin." That for him, those are two important qualities, right? Because that's what he's looking for his master's son. So I think it's interesting that the first thing God does for him is he doesn't just meet the needs of a woman of virtue and character, but he also makes her pretty. I love that. That part is so cool. Because do you remember Isaac's mother, Sarah? What was one of the strongest things that we hear about her? She was beautiful. And all I can think of is, boy, I bet their kids are going to be gorgeous, right? That's a grandmother's heart right there. Yeah, they're going to have pretty babies. Okay. So she's beautiful. She's a virgin. So what do we see going on with the dynamics here? What is he observing about it? Because it literally says in here that he is watching her. Where did it say that? 21. Thank you. Meanwhile, the man was gazing at her in silence, right? Do you see that? So he's watching her. For. I think this is really an important thing for young girls in particular and young men as well to remember. Adults are watching. They're looking at not just what you've said, but what you're doing. And how you're doing it, the attitude you have when you're doing it, the attention to detail, the thoroughness of the work, all these things matter because these all play toward your character. Are you a person that just sloughs off and halfway does stuff, or do you do it heartily as unto the Lord, for it is the Lord Christ whom you are serving? And I think that everything we do, I remember this verse when I was very young in my marriage, that someone had shared this one with me, because I think I was complaining about, housework and kids and babies. Who knows what I complained about something probably. I'm assuming. And I remember them quoting this to me and how that had an impact in the change of my attitude about folding laundry, doing dishes, running a vacuum, picking up the kids' toys for the 700th time that day or that week, right? Some of those monotonous day-to-day things. So this is something that for them, drawing water was a daily task, and it was a lot of work. It's not like turning on the tap, right? I get annoyed when I have to fill the coffee pot water and standing there waiting for the coffee because my water pressure is so slow it takes forever, and I'm standing there and I'm waiting, right? This girl had to fill a bucket one at a time. And how many camels did he take with him? 10. Can you imagine how much water she had to draw to satisfy the thirst of 10 camels?
I saw a comparison here, because she's basically being a servant.
Right.
And if you look at the words that were used when Abraham was waiting on the Lord, it's saying she does things quickly, she's running, she's quick.
Yes, I saw that
So
too.
it wasn't just like,
Exactly.
she was like, let's get this done, I'll get this done as quick as I can.
And in other words, she was serving him with an attitude of happiness and servitude. So did you make a character list on what you saw in Rebecca here? If you did, you're laughing at me. I saw that, Amanda. She's like, no, I didn't. Okay, I want to give you my list here. First of all, I saw in her, in verse 14, that she was a kind woman. She showed kindness to a stranger, right? She was willing to help others in need. There's this eagerness and this willingness to help others. She was a hard worker. She didn't just do it partly. She didn't just give him a drink and say, that's good enough for me, and walk away. She then extended additional. So she went on, she was quick to help even a stranger. She offered without prompting, I will also take care of your camels. She didn't wait for someone to ask her, will you do this? I mean, this is something our young kids today, I think, are not as good at. I know when I was a kid, man, I would get a smack upside the back of the head occasionally, like, get your tail in there and help fix that dinner or set that table or pick things up. I mean, parents used to, young men, get up out of that chair, let the adult sit. You don't sit when an adult is in the room. I mean, we don't teach these things to our kids anymore. The idea of being polite, of being a servant, of being respectful of age, of also just being a hard worker. Hard work is almost like, oh, I don't want to do that. Yes, you do. You want to do it if you love the Lord. You want to do whatsoever you do unto the Lord, because it is God whom you are serving. And that is exactly what I think 𝐿𝐸𝐴𝐳 was looking for here. He gazed at her, saw her kindness, saw her willingness to help, saw that she was a hard worker. Not only that, but to top it all off, she was properly a virgin, and she was beautiful. Isn't that awesome? So he was watching all this, okay? So he went prepared by prayer cover. It says in, let me make sure I'm in the right place, 15 to 21 is where we're at here.
Actually, look up the drinking of the camels.
Uh-huh.
Each camel can drink up to 20 gallons.
Oh, my God. You know, I don't know, but I think I'd be calling in the troops to help. But, yeah.
Well, I know we're gonna get to the part, but like, 'cause we don't know yet, we know when he explains it, but I think some of the gazing too was like, he not even really finished the prayer, like immediately,
Yeah.
here she is, like God was so fast to answer that prayer, you're like, well,
Yeah.
sure, God, is this the one? Cause that was kinda fast, like.
Yeah, I know, exactly. And I do think it's very interesting that he did seem to have a little bit of a hesitation. Well, okay, now wait a minute. Am I really sure this is the one that God has appointed? And so he does a little bit of negotiation here. So we see the unfolding of this drama, this narrative is so detailed. It's almost like they're trying to point out to us, God is trying to point out to us so many nuances to the storyline here that we could almost miss them, and we could spend, like we just did, talking about the character of Rebecca here. That itself is, you know, for me, I spent probably 20 or 30 minutes just rereading and rereading that passage and saying, what am I seeing in this woman that he was observing, he was gazing at? And why is that important? And what am I learning about that? And I think about this, okay, forget the young girls. I'm an old woman, but do I still do these things? Am I still eager to serve? Am I still a generous person? Am I still having an attitude that's right, that pleases God? And that others, when they look at me, are they saying, wow, that person is doing for the Lord according to what God would want? Or, boy, she sure is a sour old woman. I hope not, right? But we can get there if we aren't keeping ourselves in check. So this is a great opportunity to say, am I being in the eyes of others who are watching me what I should be? Right?
This really became personal to me. I've read the story before, but at my age now, talking about Sarah
Yeah.
being as old as she was and conceiving, I'm thinking, that really is a miracle. There's no way
I do think they were stronger and healthier than we are today, but still, yeah. I mean, I know. Listen, my mind went there too. I'm like, oh no. Okay, so 22 to 27 then, it's, what do we see going on in 22 to 27?
Basically, he thinks it's her, so he just asks, who are you?
Yes,
We need,
yes.
he's told again from the family, so we're hoping now that from the family.
Okay, so what he sees here is he believes God guided him. So he's going to step out on faith on that, right? Had guided him, and that it was to his master's relatives. Because what's the question he asks? Whose daughter are you? Okay, he's already observed her. He's already figured out she qualifies in every way, but now there's this problem because he says, from my relatives, I want you to go. Because why do you think Abraham was specific about it being his relatives?
That would be the people he's most familiar with their faith.
Oh,
Like who's God
there you
they're
go.
serving.
It has to do with the faith, right? He wants to connect her in an equally yoked relationship with his son. Other people from Mesopotamia, not all of them, serve and worship Yahweh. So he says, go back to my family. I know there you will find someone who worships the Lord. And that's what he was looking for. So he believes he was guided to Rebekah. He now knows that it's the house of Abraham. So we're already seeing that he says in 27, blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his loving kindness. So first he says, please give me your loving kindness. Shower us with this loving kindness. Now he's thanking him. Even before the whole thing is transpired, he's now thanking him that God has shown him loving kindness and his truth toward my master. As for me, the Lord has guided me in the way of the house of my master's brothers. That's an amazing thing. So he shows up at this well in Haran. I've been there. Barren, dry. Anyway, it had to be beautiful back then, but it's not now. But he shows up at this place. He doesn't know anybody. He's not, familiar with everything. And here comes this girl, and he spots her. Ooh, she's cute, right? She's beautiful, and I think she qualifies. And then he observes her, and check, check, check. And then he goes, excuse me, whose family are you from? Oh, check. Do you see how this is playing out? It's almost as if there's a sovereign God guiding his steps. What do you think?
Well, it's clear he kind of knew it had to be her because he already put the ring and the bracelets of value on her before he asked the question. So he's watched her because he had a very specific prayer.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, I need her to say these words, do these things, and then I'll know.
Right. So
And
he'd
he saw
already,
it, he
yes.
watched that, gave her the stuff, and then this was like this, just make sure whose family.
Oh, by the way, I better double check on this. Whose family are you? Yeah, exactly. So what we see then is in prayer. So what does this teach us about prayer for ourselves? You can be very specific with God on things. Now, I think there's a verse that says, don't tempt the Lord thy God either, right? But I do believe that when you are in a situation where you really need to know the will of God, and you don't know for sure, for you to lay out before the Lord some kind of a request for the purpose of finding his will, does that satisfy that thing? Ask anything in my name, and it shall be given unto you. If your desire is to find God's will, not your will, but that you really need to know, God, is this what you want from me? Is this where I should go? Is this the work you want from me? Is this the activity I should be doing or not doing? Or is this the bride or the groom for my child? When you're asking God for something that specific for the purpose of finding his will, and that is your only reason in asking, is that you be obedient to God in it and that you fulfill what God wants for that. The one whom God has appointed is what he was looking for. So he's looking for God's will. He is actually praying according to God's way of wanting us to do it to get the right answers. And this is awesome. So this guy, he says, so you've guided me in the way of my master's house. And then the girl did what? The next part. She ran again.
She ran to her mom.
You know, the idea of the running, and she runs to the house, to her mother's family, and also to her brother. And she's giving all these details. But the fact that they stated up front that she ran, what does that tell you about what's going on in her mind? She must be excited. This must be something that's like, oh, I'm excited about this. This is, you know, who knows what her prospects were in the town that she was in, or who she might have had as a prospect. But at this point, what does she know about this prospect, even though she's never met him? He's God-fearing. Yay, check. Now what?
That he's a servant of a relative.
That it comes from relatives, okay, yes. Ah, he's got money, honey. Because how many camels did he have? 10. Now, I don't know about you guys, but my husband always tells a story about how he was going to sell me off for, how many camels was it? Do you remember? I can't remember. 6 camels or something. And camels in those days, and this is a true story. We were in Haran. Haran, Urfa, and 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐭. We were actually in the city of 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐭, I think, when this happened. But we were on that trip in Turkey. So, at this very place. And my husband met a man on the street, and I was walking down the road with a winnowing fork in my hand. I had purchased a winnowing fork off the street. And there was an old man there, and he was trying to buy me from my husband. But of course, it was a joke. But they bantered back and forth, got him up to 6 camels. He says, you know how much 6 camels? Do you know how much a camel's worth? $25,000 a pop. I went, whew. He says, yeah, I was going to throw the kids in for free. Yeah, but you know, the idea that he showed up with 10 camels shows wealth. Not to mention that he had all these beautiful gifts and all the gold and all the, so for her, he was also checking some boxes. Not that she's hungry for money, but she was looking for security. And this is what all women want, right, when we marry. We want to know that we are finding a man that can take care of us and will provide for us, and that God will look over and protect us in that way. So, no, they don't even mention it in here at all. But we do get the hint that she's excited about this prospect. She's running to tell, and also the conclusion of it, when she agrees to go without hesitation, even though the family is kind of urging her to stay back, right? And she said, oh, no, I'll go. She had already made up in her mind that this man was going to be the right man. Now, it's very different from the way that we go into marriage. We have a courting, we date them, we get to know them, we maybe spend time with their family. We check it all out kind of to feel out the prospects. But in her case, she has no idea. She doesn't know what he looks like. She doesn't know anything really personally about him, his habits, his personality. She doesn't know any of that. So what's going on in this storyline about marriage? What is it telling us about marriage? What should marriage be based on? Character. Okay, character. The Lord. Of all things, the Lord. Being equally yoked is going to establish a marriage from the beginning. And about them being equally yoked, what is the most important quality about that for marriage, as far as the subject of marriage is concerned?
You have the same belief system.
Yeah. What do we believe as Christians about marriage? It's a covenant forever until death do you part, right? And so in the mind of this young woman and in the mind of Isaac, who knows his dad has sent someone off to get him a wife, both of them understand that when they stand before God and make a vow, it's for life. And so they have already, without meeting one another, without seeing the personalities or the appearance or anything else about one another, they have already determined in their hearts, before they even meet, that if she says yes and she does, and he's going to accept her and he does, they both have a commitment until death do us part. So they both start out their marriage on that footing that divorce is not even a part of the conversation. It's not to enter.
In our day, when we got married, I think it was part of the wedding.
It was with my wedding vow 50 years ago. Yeah. I know, often they don't. They write their own vows and God doesn't even, they don't even marry in churches now before God. They don't even necessarily have a pastor. They have a friend marry them.
Well, don't get married at all.
Well, don't get married at all, just move in.
I think it's also a picture of choosing to love, not
Thank
falling
you.
in love.
Thank you. That is exactly it. So what happens is then they come together and it says, and he loved her at the end of this, right? So what it shows you then is they both go into it with an understanding until death do they part. They are making a vow of covenant before God himself, and God is the most important central part of it. They're going to enter into this relation knowing that love will grow. And I think that is far more secure of a marriage down the road if you both have the attitude that it is a relationship that is forever and that divorce is not something that you would ever utter, and therefore you're both fully committed.
Well, I think that's the fully committed part is the thing that we don't have nowadays.
Right.
Because there are plenty of people that I know that like joke or even say that if this doesn't work out, we've already decided who gets what. And I was like, how do you even like go down the aisle thinking if you get divorced, I get the car and you
Right.
get the house? You're
Well,
not already there.
Yeah, exactly. Prenuptials, right? A lot of people go in with prenuptials. This is not what you should ever do. Or women who go into marriage and don't take their husband's name. Well, the whole idea of a covenant is the exchanging of a name. Remember, we've just studied all that when we did our covenant study. When Abraham and Sarah went into covenant with God, what did God do for them? Renamed them. He became from Abram to Abraham, and from Sarai to Sarah, both of them receiving a portion of the Lord's name, the AH part. So in doing that, they take on their partner's name, and that's covenant making. Right? I know, it's really hard because our generation, number one, was never taught that. So a lot of us, I didn't, but I'm just blessed to be a blonde and young. I didn't know that you really shouldn't, so I did it. But there are a lot of people who don't, and a lot of it was the pressure of the women's lib movement that came in on the scene. And so we have a whole, not just one generation, but 2 or 3 generations of women who have been taught that it's demeaning to take the husband's name and to be identified as one in that way. And so they have 2 names or whatever. And it really is, sadly, I think it's a lack of training. It's a lack of not knowing. And I think, I remember 𝐏𝐚𝐫𝐭. Do you guys remember her? Gail, yes. When she first came to my precept studies many years ago, she had her own last name. And through the covenant study, she and her husband went down and corrected her records, and she now has his name. Because of precept study of the subject of covenant and understanding that principle. But see, she had not been taught. She said, I was never taught that. I didn't know that. She fixed it as soon as she knew. And that's an awesome story. Okay. Let's finish this up. 28 to 41. He is looking for the maiden that God has appointed. That was important. He is looking for the wife God has appointed. I like that name, appointed, or that word appointed. How far am I on time?
10:30 minutes.
Okay. I just don't want to run out of time because, okay, 41. Oh, I see. I missed one in between here. Hold on a second. We forgot about 28 to 41. I got to fix it. Yeah, it's 28 to 41. I just put the wrong title on the wrong one. 28 to 41 is the final part of this. The final requirement, basically, is the family must agree to the union. That's what we see going on in 28 to 41, where we see the girl run to the mother's house. We see her brother getting involved. He begins to negotiate. In there, he says, this is what the man said to me. And she's telling her brother. And he was standing by the camel. So there's that reference to the fact that the man has some wealth. And he said, come in, blessed of the Lord. Did you make the connection between the statement about the camels and being blessed of the Lord? Because if you have camels, you're rich. Otherwise, you would probably just have a little donkey. Okay? So he says, come in, blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside since I have prepared the house and a place for the camels? So the man entered the house, meaning the servant, and then Laban, the brother, unloaded the camels, and he gave straw to feed the animals and water and to wash his feet. So in other words, the family was very hospitable, was very welcoming of this man. And the whole concept, after having been told what was going on here, he is coming into my house to negotiate for my sister's hand in marriage to his master. He's welcoming him. He's taking good care of him. He's being generous with him. So he said, I am Abraham's servant. So he was about to sit to eat a meal. What do we see about the servant here in this little segment 34 on? He's about to get fed. You know he's got to be hungry by this time of day, right?
I'm just showing that this is more important than eating. We gotta get this business done.
Yes. He did not want to put his own needs above the mission. The mission statement came first, okay? So now Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master in her old age, and he has given him all that he has. So he lets him know that the daughter, basically, your sister will be well cared for. We can provide, no problem. My master made me swear, saying, you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites. Now he's letting him know about the importance of their faith in God, in Yahweh. So they're really talking everything through. Everything's being put out on the table. You know, today we don't do that. We have, kids will come say, oh, I'm going to marry so-and-so. He's so cute, right? But when you sit down and say, okay, young man, how are you going to provide for my daughter? What is the job? What is your income? What are your plans, right? What about your, first and foremost, what about your faith? Who do you serve? What church do you attend? What activities are you involved in? What is your heart concerning the Lord? Do you have a ministry? Do you serve him in a certain way? What activities are you involved with? We don't do that. Well, unless you're my husband and I, we did. And it was not easy because it makes everyone feel very uncomfortable when you start doing that to someone. It feels like you're cross-examining them, and in a way you are. And that is exactly what was going on here. It was, This is who we are. This is what we do. This is what will happen in a relationship between the two of them. And God will be at the center of it all. And that is exactly what he's informing him of. But the final requirement was their approval. If there's not a family approval, then the marriage would not take place. And so he's seeking their approval on all this. Okay, then you go to 42 to 49. And he literally says that he feels that the Lord has what? There's that word appointed. Yeah. That is the Lord has appointed for my master. I'm looking for her, and I feel like this is her. Because why? How does he demonstrate that that's what he's saying here? He retells the story, right? He says, this is the fleece I threw out before the Lord, and this is what happened. So I believe because of this sign that the Lord gave to me, that she, in fact, is the one that the Lord has appointed. So I'm trusting that God answered my prayer, right? These titles were so lengthy on this one. It was really hard to bring it down to one. Have any of you anything else to say at this point about the things that we're looking at? I don't want to miss or bypass something that you want to talk about. Okay, so in this 50 to 61, this is the part where it's very interesting because it almost feels like, they acknowledge that this encounter was from the Lord, right? That it's basically a divine appointment, correct? Because they said it's the matter comes from the Lord, he says in verse 50. So we cannot speak to you bad or good. So he's literally saying we are going to accept from God whatever it is that God seems to be doing here. And because they respect the Lord, obviously, they are submissive to God, and they want to do God's will in this. And so here is Rebekah before you. Take her and go and let her be wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken. So they really feel like they're in agreement with him on this. But then the next morning, what happened? They wake up and they're going, I don't know, maybe they're a little hesitant or something, right? Now, what is these servants' reply to that in 56? Don't delay me. Now, was that in any way a part of the beginning of this story? Do you remember when he made an oath to Abraham and he said, I'll go and I'll do all these things? And then he had a question about, well, what if she won't go with me? Right? Do you remember that? So here's a spot where he's going, I wonder if this means she's not going to go with me. Maybe I misread this. Maybe this isn't from the Lord. He's hedging it. But so what does he do in response to figure it out? Say it again. Yeah, he does. And he literally says to them, well, if she's not going to go with me, then I'm going to go on my way, right? He said, do not delay me. Don't delay me. Since the Lord has prospered my way. So far, God has prospered me in every step of the way on this. If this is going to be a roadblock, then I'm just going to absolve the whole thing. That's basically kind of what he's saying here. Now, what might we learn about that concerning our prayers with God and the things that we're doing? In particular, marriage, but any subject. If you've thrown a fleece out before the Lord and God has given you a clear answer like he did Eliezer here, then all of a sudden the people that are involved throw up a roadblock. Now what? Are you willing to walk away for the sake of maybe you weren't reading God correctly? Don't be so arrogant that you go, oh no, God told me, right? But rather, what does he reply? Well, don't delay me. And if you don't, basically, either this is a done deal or it's not. And if it's not, I'm on my way. Are you catching the drift of this conversation here? He literally replies that he is saying, I'm willing to walk away from the deal. Have you ever made deals for a house bid or anything like that? You go, well, if they can't take the amount of money that we can afford, then we walk away from the deal. It breaks your heart, especially if you've fallen in love with that house. And in this case, he's fallen in love with this girl for the sake of his master's son. But he's saying, okay, wait a minute, if this is a roadblock and if this is going to be an obstacle, that I'm willing to walk away so that I don't make a mistake. Ooh, you guys are real quiet. Are you really thinking? Are you thinking on this? Are you seeing it? That he's concerned, because I think sometimes we invest ourselves sometimes in plans that we make, plans that we have, and we get so tunnel visioned on the things that are going to go, and we get things lined up and lined up and lined up. My husband and I had a situation with a house like that at one time. We even had a down payment already put down on a house. And then I was sick at my stomach over it. He was sick at his stomach over it, but we weren't talking to one another because we both thought the other one really wanted it, right? Well, finally, I said something. He said, oh, me too. And we changed our minds. And boy, are we glad we did, because after the fact, then there were other things financially that were going on, that this was the Lord really telling us, don't do this. And we listened, thankfully. One time we did it right. And that's kind of what I see here, is this is a man who's saying, look, I'm looking for the signals. I'm looking for signs from God's guidance in this. Is he opening a door or closing a door? And if you've closed a door, I'm walking. Right? Are you seeing it? Okay. So then what happens is, go ahead. Oh, boy, does it. He didn't. And what reopened it? The girl did, because the girl came back. Oh, no, I don't need to delay. I'm going. I'm on board with this. I'm in agreement. So her heart was as a matter of fact, earlier she was running to tell everybody. She was very excited. She's sold. She's sold on the whole thing. She hasn't even met him yet, but she already knows he loves God and he can provide for her. Those are two essentials, particularly in this day and time in history. And quite honestly, it should be today in this day in history as well. Does he love God, and can he provide for you? And if he can't do either of those two things, then you need to stop and ponder, right? And that's kind of what was with her. She already knew he could handle both of those things in success. So thus they sent their sister away, and her nurse also. They blessed Rebekah and said to her, may you, our sister, become thousands of 10,000s, and may your descendants possess the gate of those who hate them. Rebekah arose with her maids, and they mounted the camels, and they followed the man. So the servant took Rebekah and departed. So that was a success story. Yay. God opened the doors, were slightly closed and then flung wide back open again. So her family agrees. My pen is dried out. I'll go to this one. So her family agrees. And she accepts. Okay, and then in 62 to 66, happily ever after, what happens? Yeah, Rebekah becomes Isaac's wife. Now, it's really funny why this particular chapter was so big. And it says, and he loved her. You might want to put that on there. And he loved her. So it was a happily ever after story. There's not a whole lot of information about these two people in our text. We're going to very quickly go right past them. But God spent 62 verses showing you how these two came together. Now, what, if you pull back, look at the bigger picture, what is God showing us here now in the unfolding picture of who is God, who is man, and in particular about this nation called Israel? What is God showing us?
Well, he certainly has plans for how it's going to work out.
Okay.
He'd already had Rebecca planned for Isaac.
Literally has appointed a specific wife for a specific man. Talk about an intimate God who's involved. Do you remember what even Hagar said about God? And she named the well the God who sees and the God who hears. And God appears to her in the wilderness and makes promises to her concerning her son as well. Although he's not the chosen child that will be the seed's bloodline, yet God still loves her, God still loves her son, and God will still provide and be there for her. And so what we're seeing in account after account is a God who is the sovereign over all these things. And he has a plan. He has a perfect plan. He has a precise plan. And he has a way to get there. And he knows the end from the beginning. Isn't that an amazing thing that we're looking at here? And in this storyline, what we see, the right way to go about marriage. I never looked at this passage in this kind of detail before.
I was raised in a church that taught over and over that there is a specific spouse for you. They call it right man, right woman. And
I like that.
that you need to look for that person. A lot of churches don't teach that.
No.
Most people don't believe that. There's a lot of people out there that could be your right.
I do, and I agree with you, and I do. And I also can say this. I also see in this storyline the fact that the right man and the right woman also has a lot to do with your attitude about who you end up marrying. Whoever you end up marrying can be that right man or that right woman. You know, some of these marriages, like the ones we're going to get to when we get to Jacob, he marries the wrong woman, in his opinion. But I do think that he learns to love her.
Because you're still under covenant.
Right. And because your priority is God first, and the marriage falls under that. And so you're honoring God in the vow that you made. And I think that is the clue to success, is when you say I do, are you understanding it is God a part of that? It's a what do they say, a three-twined rope. Yeah. A cord of three. Thank you.
But also, God isn't picking somebody for you because that person is going to fulfill you. He's picking somebody for you because he wants you to go take care of that person.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're not making you happy, that doesn't matter. You still have a contract with God
Yeah.
that you're going to take care of this person.
I remember when I was discipled, the lady that was discipling me, she said, God is not so concerned about your happiness as he is your holiness. He wants you to become holy, not happy. Although happiness would be nice, and it can be attained to as well. And I do think a lot of it is it's about the attitude. You can be happy in any situation, but you can also be miserable in any. You could be in a room full of people having a party and sit in the corner and mope, right? It's all about the attitude that you have, your heart's attitude.
Spirit is joy, not happiness, but joy.
All right, seek for exactly. And what do we say about joy? Is it that's the Philippians study, right? It's joy. It's Jesus first, others second, yourself last, right? So, all right. Now, we're on to the next chapter. Is there any other things that you want to discuss about that? 24. We don't have as much time, but we won't need it for the next part, I don't think. It's a little bit quicker. We do need a title. This was so hard to title because there's so much in this. But tell me what you titled. Okay, that'll work. Did you see I had to look again? I just cannot get that name right. Okay, All right, the next one is chapter 25. Now, we did the first 3 chapters, so we've already looked at the fact that Abraham dies here. And, okay, so those are the titles of the first part of it. Now, there's more. As a matter of fact, there's like 15,000 things that go on in this chapter. It almost seems like it's segmented in such a way that there's so much involved, you almost don't know exactly what the primary focus is. But if you pull back and you consider this from the perspective of the lineage and how God is bringing about a nation, rather than all of the independent pieces of the puzzle. But what he does do is he shows us how he separates the pieces, how he makes sure that Jacob will be isolated from all the rest at some point, right? And that his people then will become a people group to themselves. Ishmael will go his way, Keturah's family will go their way, Hagar's son goes his way. Did you notice that? How there's a separation of the nations, how God is separating them onto their own lands. That is why you needed to mark those land or those geographical places that you see. Geographically, that's what God is doing, is he's making sure he's not sending people away because he is belittling them or he is thinking lowly of them. Do you remember when Abraham had to separate from Lot? The same exact thing happened there. He let Lot take his pick. You take your pick, Lot, and Lot went his way. In the end, Lot had 2 daughters, and who were their children? Moab and Ammon. And so they have the Ammonites and the Moabites, right? And so they become the people on the side of Jordan, the area of Jordan. They go on over across the river outside of Israel. That's where they are now living. So we see how God is orchestrating and segregating his own land for his own people, a people that are through a specific bloodline. And it is a bloodline that at the core of it is faith and walking with God. These are men who love God and walk with God. Okay, so we see here Abraham dies 1 to 6. Let's see, I don't have any markers that are dark enough. Okay, so 1 to 6, and there we see Abraham took another wife, right? What did you find out about that? Is this something he did after Sarah died, or is this something that may have happened before Sarah died? You think after? Okay. And at the point where he sends them off, how many years is it then from the time that Sarah dies and when Abraham dies? How many years? Yeah, so about 35 to 40 years, somewhere in there. Okay, so they had time to be born, children to be born and to be raised and to be of an age where they could be sent off to be independent, right? Okay, so the record in verses 1 through 6 is that he had how many sons by Keturah? 6 sons. And then they only mentioned 2 of them, but 2 of those sons then are also having, actually 3 of them. 𝐏𝐶𝐬𝐬𝐬 became the father of Sheba and Dedan. We know those nations, don't we? We've heard those mentioned in Scripture. And then Medan, the sons of Midian. And then he names all of them. Their names I'm not familiar with. Ephah, Epher, Hanoch, Abida, and Eldah. But we see Dedan has sons. They were Ashurim. I can't pronounce the other 2 names. But 2 of those names, at least, I'm familiar with. There's Midian, or 3 of them. Midian, Sheba, and Dedan. Now, I did not take the time to look all those names up. Did any of you do that? I was at full capacity on my amount of time I had. But I do think that if we did a word study on every one of those sons' names, we could trace where they are on a map, which of them became nations. Now, why is this recorded for us? Why do we see this here? Go back to Genesis 17:4.
God promised to make a great nation, all your descendants you can't count.
Right, and he
You gotta
was
have
going
a
to,
lot more than one or two kids.
there you go, and it was going to be nations of nations and kings of kings, right? Go back and read some Genesis 17:4. What does it say there? You will be a father of a multitude of nations. Now we know of the one nation, Israel, right, that will come through a specific bloodline, but he's also sending these sons of other relationships out. He had two concubines, because Sarah was the wife who had the seed that was going to be traced. But he also had Hagar as a concubine and Keturah as a concubine. And if you don't have, let's see, let me give you that verse that she's a concubine. That's in 1 Chronicles 1:32. You can double cross that and take a look at that. But in the end, what does God do with these sons that are mentioned here? What does it say he did with them? Well, what does Abraham do with them? Where does he send them?
He gives them things while he's alive.
And sends them where? Uh-huh.
East.
Yeah, to the east. 25:6. Sends them out to the land. In other words, they become separated. This is why this record is right here. It's here to show you two things. Number one, God fulfilled his promise to make him a multitude of nations, right? But number two, to show you how God separated the seed bloodline from the other nations. Okay? Now 7-11, Abraham dies. And God blesses Isaac. So we see that seed promise, right? It goes to Isaac. And actually, he has said that over and over. Through this specific child, I will fulfill my blessing. Okay, so Abraham dies. He lived 175 years. He died satisfied with life. And then what does it tell us about Isaac in verse 11?
He lived by Beer-lahai-roi.
And I'm going to shorten that word. He lived in Canaan. Okay, the land of Canaan. So he does not leave the land of Canaan, but the others, they go to the east, and he stays in Canaan. And that's what the point to these two sections are here. Then in 12-18 gives us the other person involved in this, and that's who? And we had a good time on that one last time. This is the generations of Ishmael. And concerning Ishmael, what did we, God promised Hagar to multiply her, right? Which I think is really interesting, because usually the multiplication of these kinds of blessings go to the husband. But this time, God says through Hagar, I'm going to bless you, and through you are going to come these multitudes of nations. So he prophesied how many princes? 12 princes. So let me give you those verses. That's in 16:10 is that first scripture, and then the next one is in 21:8, where he promises Hagar to multiply her, and then the 12 princes is stated in 21:8. Now, at the end then, we see here in 25:12, Ishmael had 12 princes, right? Because they're listed for us. Has 12 sons. I'm having a hard time writing today. And we see that right here in 25, verses 12-15. And that fulfills 17:10. Okay? Or 17:20, sorry. I hope I got those verses all right. Blessed because, why? Why did God bless Ishmael concerning these children, this abundance?
Promise to Hagar when she was afraid that
That's exactly right. That is exactly right. So part of it was because he made a promise to Hagar herself. But why did he make the promise to Hagar? Because of Abraham. There you go. Blessed Ishmael, because he is Abraham's descendant. Again, that word loving kindness is the connection in all these references here. Okay, and that's in 21:13. Somebody want to flip to there real quick, just so we see it together? It's been a while since we looked at it.
And of the son of the maid I will make a nation also, because he is your descendant.
There you go. And the son of the maid I will make a nation also, because he is your descendant. That's the loving kindness of God that overflows from the covenant partner to those who he is affiliated with. Okay, then the next one is starting in 19. Now this is where we begin our homework today. This was simply review. And his descendants also settled where? East of Egypt. Okay? Whoops, I should have underlined the whole thing. No. Okay, east of Egypt. So that gives you another land place. So these are to the east. This one is Canaan. This one is east of Egypt. Now we're in the next one. Now we have another reference to a Toledot. Again, the first one was the generations of Ishmael, right? And remember, do you remember what that word Toledot meant? It simply is the Hebrew word for these are the generations of. If you wanted to say these are the generations of in the Hebrew language, you say Toledot. Much quicker than our English. All right, so the Toledot that's given to us in 19 to 23 are the generations of who? Mm-hmm. Okay, and concerning that, what do we see happens there? That's because what we're looking at here are how God is separating the nations. It's another mini form of it. Remember back, what was it in chapter 5? Was it the separation of the nations? I might be wrong on that. But this is another one of those places where it's not the separation of the nations globally, but it's the separation of the nations, meaning separating out or segregating or protecting, basically, Israel to be its own unique nation. And there are other people that will be nations that come out of Abraham and his descendants, but Israel will be protected as God's specific nation for a blessing. Okay, so what do we see then in 19 to 23 that shows that to us?
God gives their prophecy about the two children.
Yeah.
Two nations.
Yep.
The older's gonna serve the younger.
So Isaac and Rebekah, they conceive twins. Right? And then it says, and then God foretells her two nations in her womb. That's why they're fighting with one another in there. That was in 25, 23. And so then the next part of the story tells us how those become two nations instead of one. If they're born twins, it seems logical that they would actually join to get forces and be one nation, right? But instead, what happens? How does it become two nations, as God said?
So Esau sells his birthright.
Yep, Esau sold his birthright. We did a lot of work on that subject of the birthright and the firstborn. What did you learn about the birthright of the firstborn? Mm-hmm. Yep. So they get a double one of the privileges of being the firstborn is a double portion, also of authority in the house or to take that authority leadership, right? What else? They become the spiritual leader, the spiritual head of the home. They become basically the priest. Yes, it was. Thank you. So he despised it. You know, one of the things is it's not just privileges, though, that come to him. Also responsibilities come to him. So it's kind of like the king who becomes the king. He was the prince first, but when he becomes a king, there used to be a saying that I used to say a lot. I'm a princess because queens have responsibilities. I want to be the princess, not the queen. Well, that's kind of what this whole scenario is about. As a firstborn son, yes, you get the double portion inheritance. Yes, you get the double blessing. Yes, you get basically you get to be the boss and tell people what to do, so to speak. But with it is also responsibility. You are to be the spiritual leader. You're also the protector. You're also the protector and provider of things like the mom when she becomes a widow, or any sisters who might be under your care. You have to. That's why we saw Laban doing what for Rebekah back in the last story. Laban was who? Her brother. And what did he do with the servant? He was negotiating for whether she would go or not, right? So he was stepping in. Apparently he had become the leader in that home for whatever reason. It talked about her running back to her mother's household, but it didn't say to her dad. So apparently the brother had become the head of that household as the firstborn, probably. And he was negotiating for Rebekah with the servant when there was this negotiation going on. Dad's nowhere in the scenario, is he? Well, I don't think so. I mean, I didn't see him there. No, let's go back and look just to be sure. Starting in verse 28, the girl ran and told her mother's household about these things. Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban, and Laban ran outside to the man at the spring. Now, if there had been a dad around, Dad would have been the one to do that. When
Laban and Bethuel replied.
Okay, where is that one at?
24, verse 50.
I'm wondering if he was so elderly that Laban had taken those responsibilities on, because that's another part of this list of what happens with the firstborn. If dad becomes unable because of physical, maybe he's got dementia, or who knows what his problems were. It sounds like the brother here is the one taking the position of the firstborn, and he's taking on those responsibilities. So that's what I was reading. It was just a passing thought. In any event, it doesn't really matter. We know the brother did it, and why he did it, we're not sure. It doesn't tell us. But I think it's because he was fulfilling the role of the firstborn. So he says they have distinct benefits and obligations. He is believed to represent the prime of the human strength and vitality in that home. So as a result, the firstborn son became the primary heir of the family. It involved a double portion of the household estate and the leadership of the family if his father became incapable, and or incapacitated. If he was absent for some reason. There's a reference here to something in Deuteronomy that shows that. After his death, the eldest son then usually cared for his mother until her death and provided for his unmarried sisters. So it looked like that's what Laban was doing. He was taking care of mom and the sister. And
I never thought about it before, but that's why he got the wealth, because the wealth was to help him do all these tasks.
yes,
Not because he was special
no,
or whatever.
but he gave it to him because he was being the leader of the, right. I guess that's where I made the assumption that Dad wasn't even there. I guess he was there, but he really wasn't. He was there in body only. He just wasn't running things anymore because he probably had become incapable of doing so. So that would be a good demonstration of that. The firstborn, talked about other things here, but it talked about the firstborn could sell his rights. Did you know that? But it's considered evil. It's considered a sin against God to do so, because you're abdicating your responsibilities to someone else, and you're also thinking lightly of them. you're considering of what is of high value in God's eyes, which is the position of the firstborn, because later Jesus is the firstborn. It's the same kind of picture with marriage. Marriage is a picture of our relationship with Christ, right? We're his bride, he's our husband. So marriage, therefore, is sanctified in a way. It's a high holy article before God, and he uses it as a picture of our relationship with God. Well, here we have the firstborn of the family also is a picture of Jesus as the firstborn of God. And so this article is really good. This one is Got Questions. I just Googled it and had all kinds of really good stuff in here.
Today, you can kind of think of it as he's the trustee of the family.
Yes, yes, yes. And even more than that. I mean, he's the trustee, but he's like, he becomes the fatherhead of, yes. He becomes like Christ is to the church. Yeah, the head of the house is that. Okay, so Esau sold his birthright, big no-no, right? And therefore, this is how we get, now remember what he also called him? He gave him a name in verse 30. Esau was called what? Esau was called Edom. Does that sound familiar? Again, another nation, right? There you go, that's your other nation. And God had already said that the older will serve the younger. And we know that younger is Jacob, who becomes Israel. So, are you seeing the pattern here? All of this is geography. It's a geography lesson on how God separated his people from the rest. All right.
Point out that Rebecca was barren for 20 years.
I know. We didn't talk about it. Okay. That's very interesting, isn't it? And now, yeah. And it really follows into shadow. Now, tell me the distinction between the barrenness of Rebecca and the barrenness of Sarah. How did they handle it differently?
They prayed. Jacob prayed for her.
Mm-hmm. He prayed. How long was it before she had a baby, though?
Not long.
Well, I don't know if it doesn't really say, but we know she was barren for how many years? A long time, like 20 years or something. They had been married a long time before they had their baby. So what did they not do that Sarah did? Oh, here, let me give you my concubine. As a matter of fact, one of the things I did read in commentary was that Rebecca and Isaac, their marriage was monogamous. And Isaac never took another wife. And he never took another concubine like his dad did before him. And like Jacob will later. And Jacob will have 4. But he has 1. So I think it's really neat. It's a very compact story about one man in this bloodline. It's really only about the relationship and how they produce a child of 2 nations, Esau and Jacob. And then we move on from them. That's it. Boom. A blip on the screen. But a beautiful picture of a marriage that was done right. It was established correctly to begin with. It was set up and it was arranged, so to speak. But the arrangement was done God's way. And the 2 of them remained faithful to one another, as it really should be. One man, one woman. Pretty cool.
It doesn't say anything about how long she was barren. It just says he was 40 years old when he took her.
No, he goes
And then he prayed on behalf.
And he was 60 years old or something?
60 years old when she gave birth to him.
What verse is that?
26.
Is that 20,
His brother came forth with his hand.
25? And 25, 26. He was 60 years old
Yes.
when twins were born.
20 years.
Yeah. But he began praying. Give me the verse where it said he prayed and he was 40 years old.
21 is when he prays. It just says that Isaac was 40 years old and 20 when he took Rebecca.
So that was 25, 20.
Yes, and then Isaac prayed
Okay, so there's your time factor right there. It shows you there was 20 years of waiting for God to give them a child, but neither of them considered jumping the gun on this.
How long did
Close.
Sarah and Abraham wait?
A long time.
20 years?
75, 100. I think that's right.
Either 20 or 25 years,
I think that's about right.
go back and look. So
Yeah, I'd be curious. It really does. What I think is amazing is that it was a monogamous relationship. I think that's really cool. All right, we did it. We got through 2 very lengthy chapters. There was a lot more in there, and I know we didn't get to talk. Y'all did not miss anything, did you? Was there any other things that you needed to ask before we wrap this up? That's it? We did good. All right, well, we're on to the next segment for next week. We're going to be doing chapters 26 and 27. Have fun.